The first time I walked through that door, I was holding a key that weighed more than everything I owned combined. It was an old iron key, the kind that looks like it belongs in a fairy tale, and the woman at the city office had handed it to me with the expression of someone passing off a problem they were happy to never think about again. I remember standing on the sidewalk outside the Kovach Cinema on Allegheny Avenue, in a neighborhood that Pittsburgh had mostly forgotten about, with that key in my hand and a garbage bag of clothes on the ground next to me, thinking that I had either just made the smartest decision of my 19 years of life or the absolute dumbest one. I did not know yet that the answer was neither. I did not know yet that what was waiting for me inside that building had nothing to do with smart or dumb. It had to do with something much older than me, something that had been waiting in the dark for someone exactly like me for a very long time. But to understand what I found inside the Kovach Cinema, you first need to understand what I had lost before I ever set foot in it. And that story does not start on Allegheny Avenue. That story starts in my mother's kitchen on a Tuesday morning in November, with a cup of coffee that was already cold and a sentence I have spent years trying to forget and have never quite managed to. My mother looked at me across the kitchen table and said, "I think it would be better for both of us if you found somewhere else to live." That was it. No fight, no explosion, no dramatic scene. Just that sentence delivered in the same tone she used to announce that the grocery store was out of her brand of yogurt. I was 19 years old. I had been working part-time at a copy shop for $7.50 an hour for 8 months, saving almost every dollar because I had been planning to take classes at the community college in January. I had $212 in a checking account, a phone with a cracked screen, and a garbage bag I had bought at the dollar store the night before, because something in the way my mother had been looking at me all week told me I needed to be prepared. I was not prepared. I had been living with my mother since I was born, obviously, but the dynamic between us had been deteriorating for years, in ways I am not sure I can explain to someone who has not lived inside something like that. It was not violence. It was not cruelty in any way that leaves a mark you can point to. It was something quieter and harder to name, the feeling of being in a space where your presence is tolerated rather than wanted, where you learn to take up as little room as possible. I had been doing that for so long that I had almost forgotten there was a version of me underneath all that adjusting. The morning she said those words to me, I finished my cold coffee, stood up, went to my room, and packed everything into that garbage bag. It took about 20 minutes. I said goodbye to the dog. I did not say goodbye to my mother. I walked out the front door and did not look back, and the not looking back was the only decision I made that morning that I am still proud of. I spent 3 nights in a shelter on the North Side. I'm not going to spend a long time on those 3 nights because I do not think they are the most important part of this story, but I want to be honest about them because I think a lot of people who end up in situations like mine spend years being ashamed, and I refuse to be ashamed of surviving. The shelter was clean, and the people who ran it were kind, and a woman who checked me in on the first night told me about a job opening at a grocery store on Penn Avenue. I applied the next morning and got a call back that same afternoon and started 2 days later. The store was called Hartley's Market, and it had been on that corner for 31 years, and the man who owned it was named Gerald Hartley, who everyone called Mr. G. He was the kind of person who registers his employees on their first day without being asked, which is something I only understood the significance of later. He was a quiet man in his 60s with reading glasses perpetually on top of his head and a habit of whistling something unidentifiable while he restocked the cereal aisle. He gave me 22 hours a week to start and told me that if I needed to leave early for anything important, I should just tell him, not ask him, because asking implied he might say no, and he was not planning to say no. I found a room in a shared house 3 blocks from the store for $320 a month. There were 4 other people living there, none of whom I remember clearly, except for a woman named Diane, who knocked on my door on my second night to ask if I wanted some of the soup she had made because she had made too much. I said yes. I do not think Diane will ever know what that bowl of soup meant to me. That was my life in early December. A room in a shared house, a job at a grocery store, $212 in an account that was slowly getting less small, and a very precise, very controlled kind of loneliness that I had gotten so used to carrying that I sometimes forgot it was there. I heard about the Kovac Cinema for the first time on a Wednesday afternoon during my break behind the store. A delivery driver named Pete stopped there a few times a week, and he was the kind of person who talked continuously, regardless of whether anyone was actively listening. On that Wednesday, he was telling a story about a property dispute involving his cousin's husband, and somewhere in the middle of it he mentioned that there was an old cinema building on Allegheny Avenue that the city had been trying to get rid of for years because nobody wanted it. I said, "What kind of cinema?" Pete seemed surprised I had been listening. He said it was one of those old neighborhood movie houses, single screen, built sometime in the 1930s, closed for decades. Nobody had been inside in years. The neighborhood kids called it haunted. He said the minimum bid at the last city auction had been $200, and nobody had placed a bid. $200. That night I looked it up. The city of Pittsburgh maintained an online portal for tax-delinquent property auctions, and the Kovac Cinema at 914 Allegheny Avenue was listed exactly as Pete had described. 34 years of unpaid property taxes, no identified heirs, no pending claims. The minimum bid was $200. The auction was still open for 11 more days. I sat on my bed in the shared house and looked at that listing for a long time. I want to be clear about what I was thinking, because it matters. I was not thinking about a business plan or renovation costs or anything a sensible person should probably have been thinking about. What I was thinking about was something more basic and more urgent. I was thinking about the fact that I was 19 years old and I was paying $320 a month for a room that was not mine, in a house where I was a guest among strangers, and that the closest thing I had ever had to a place that felt like it belonged to me was a bedroom I had left with a garbage bag in under 20 minutes. I was thinking about what it would mean to have a door with my name on it, any door, even a broken one, even a haunted one on a street that Pittsburgh had mostly forgotten about. The next morning I went to the bank on my lunch break. My account was at $347. I asked about personal loans for first-time borrowers with documented employment. The loan officer looked at my pay stubs from Hartley's Market and said that with my employment record and direct deposit history, I qualified for a small personal loan of up to $500 at a fixed interest rate, repayable over 24 months. I asked for $350. I placed my bid that night. $200 for the Kovac Cinema at 914 Allegheny Avenue. I placed it from my phone, sitting on my bed, with Diane's television coming through the wall, and I felt something shift in my chest when I pressed confirm. Something between terror and recognition. Nobody outbid me. 9 days later, I received an email from the city of Pittsburgh confirming that I was the new owner of the property. I picked up the key the following morning before my shift. The woman at the desk handed it to me with that expression. The problem she was happy to never think about again expression. I went to the cinema for the first time that Saturday after my shift ended. The neighborhood around Allegheny Avenue had that particular Pittsburgh quality of a place that was once very much alive and is now deciding whether it wants to be alive again. Some businesses open, some closed, houses renovated, and houses with boards on the windows. A few old men sitting on a stoop outside a barber shop who looked at me with the mild curiosity of people who have seen everything. The cinema was between a laundromat and a vacant lot. The facade was remarkable even in its deterioration, Art Deco style, with a marquee that had lost most of its letters over the decades and now read only KVC and a stray A in the wrong position. The brick was dark with Pittsburgh soot, and vines had climbed the left wall to the second story and were investigating the roofline. Above the entrance, carved into the stone lintel in letters that were still sharp and clear despite everything, were the words, "Where ordinary people become part of the story." I stood on the sidewalk and looked at those words for a long time. Then I put the key in the lock and went inside. The darkness was the first thing, not the darkness of a room where the lights are off, but the darkness of a space that has not seen daylight in a very long time. I stood in the lobby with my phone flashlight on and just breathed for a moment. The lobby was large, much larger than I expected. The floor was terrazzo, cracked in places, but largely intact, in a geometric pattern of cream and burgundy that must have been beautiful when it was new and was still somehow beautiful in its ruin. The ticket counter ran the length of the right wall. 2 sets of double doors straight ahead led to the auditorium. A staircase on the left, carpeted in something that had once been red, led up to a balcony level, and there was a smell, old wood, dust. Something faintly chemical that I would later learn was the smell of old film stock, the cellulose and silver compounds that movie reels are made of, a smell that has no analogue in the modern world, and under all of it something I could not name then, something that smelled improbably like possibility. I pushed through the double doors into the auditorium. The screen was still there, enormous, its white surface gone yellow and spotted with water damage from a ceiling leak long since stopped. The seats were in their original rows, many still upright, all covered in the same uniform layer of dust. The ceiling was vaulted, with ornamental plasterwork showing a grapevine motif, and in the center where a chandelier had once hung, there were only empty sockets and a circular shadow on the plaster. In the upper rear of the auditorium was the projection booth window, dark and impenetrable. I stood in the back and pointed my phone flashlight at the screen and thought about all the people who had sat in those seats. Pittsburgh was built by working people, by the men and women who had poured steel in the mills along the rivers for generations. They had come here on Friday nights and Saturday afternoons. They had sat in these seats and watched the light move across that screen, and for a few hours they had been somewhere else, part of a story larger than the mill and the shift and the tired bones. The seats held that history in their dust. I had no money to fix any of this. What I had was something harder to explain. Standing in the back of that auditorium, I had the strongest feeling I have ever had in my life that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Not where I had chosen to be, not where any logical sequence of decisions had led me. Where I was supposed to be, in a way that felt older than me and larger than me. I know how that sounds. I am not a mystical person, but I believed in that feeling the way you believe in the ground under your feet. I moved in 3 weeks later. That means I had a sleeping bag on the terrazzo floor, a camping lantern from the hardware store for $16, a bin with my clothes, and a key in my pocket. No heat. December in Pittsburgh. I wore 2 sweatshirts and a hat to sleep, and used the utility sink in the back hallway that still had cold water. I walked to Hartley's for my shifts and used the staff bathroom there, and Mr. G did not ask questions, which I think was his particular form of kindness. The first night I slept there, something happened that I had been warned about by the neighborhood and had tried to prepare for and was not prepared for at all. At exactly 8 o'clock in the evening, the cinema came to life, not dramatically, not with a crash or a flash, a low mechanical sound from somewhere above me like a motor waking after a long sleep, and then a thin beam of white light appeared from the projection booth window, cutting through the dark of the auditorium and landing on the yellow-spotted screen at the far end. Not a film, just light. Pure white light from a projector with nothing loaded, casting its empty brightness onto a screen that had not seen it in 40 years. I sat up in my sleeping bag and stared at it. The light held for about 90 seconds. Then the motor sound again, and the light went out, and the cinema was dark. I went outside and stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the projection booth window, now dark and showing nothing. An old man was walking a very small dog half a block away and looked at me standing in the December cold and kept walking. I went back inside. It happened again the following night. 8 o'clock exactly. The motor, the light, 90 seconds, darkness. On the third night I was ready. I positioned myself at the bottom of the stairs before 8 o'clock, and when the motor started I went up fast, following the sound, and found a narrow hallway at the back of the balcony level, and at the end of that hallway was a door with a padlock on it. Through the gap under the door I could see the light from inside, and feel through the floor the faint vibration of a machine doing what it had been built to do. The next day, I bought a bolt cutter at the locksmith on Penn Avenue for $8. I cut the padlock the following morning. The projection booth was long and narrow, running the full width of the rear wall. It smelled intensely of that chemical smell, much stronger here, metallic and slightly sweet. In the center stood the projector. It was enormous and extraordinary, all cast iron and brass and polished steel, with 2 large circular reels mounted on top, and it was spotlessly clean. In a building abandoned for 40 years, in a sealed room, this machine had been maintained. There was no dust on it. The metal gleamed. Someone had oiled the mechanisms, covered the lens with a cloth, and left the power connected to a timer that was still, 4 decades later, doing exactly what it had been set to do. Along the right wall were shelves, floor to ceiling the entire length of the room, and on every shelf were film canisters, round, flat metal canisters of 16mm film, stacked and organized and labeled in handwriting that was small and precise and slanted slightly to the right. There were hundreds of them. I would later count 348 canisters, each labeled with a name and a date. I pulled one from the shelf. The label read, Marchetti Family, Christmas 1953. I pulled another. Kowalski Wedding, July 1947. Another, Hernandez Quinceañera, June 1961. Another, Kim Family, New Year, 1959. I stood in the projection booth with film canisters in my hands and understood slowly and then all at once what I was looking at. These were not commercial films. These were home movies, films of ordinary families, filmed by someone with a 16mm camera, developed and stored and preserved with a care that bordered on the sacred. 348 canisters, 348 families, weddings and holidays and birthdays and ordinary Tuesday afternoons that someone had decided were worth preserving. Memories of the working people of Pittsburgh's North Side, filmed over decades and archived here in the dark, waiting. In the corner of the projection booth, on a small wooden table next to the projector, was a notebook. Cloth-bound dark green, its cover worn thin at the corners. I opened it to the first page. The handwriting was the same as on the canisters, small and precise, slanting slightly to the right. The first line read, "These people deserve to be remembered, because 50 years from now someone is going to want to know who they were, and when that someone comes looking, I want there to be an answer." The name on the inside cover was Margaret Kovach. I sat down on the floor of the projection booth with the notebook in my lap, and the film canisters on the shelves around me, and the cleaned and waiting projector in front of me, and I read. I had gone to the Carnegie Library earlier that week on my day off, and asked the reference librarian about historical records related to Allegheny Avenue businesses from the 1930s. She was a woman in her 50s who took the question seriously and spent 10 minutes pulling together microfilm rolls, a bound volume of neighborhood business directories, and a thin folder of photocopied newspaper clippings filed under Pittsburgh neighborhood history. I had spent 4 hours at that library. The cinema had been built in 1931. The permit was filed in the name of Margaret A. Kovach, sole proprietor, with an address on Perrysville Avenue. Seating for 420 persons. The Carnegie Library had a photograph of the opening night showing a line of people on the sidewalk and a marquee that read, "Grand Opening, Kovach's Palace of Pictures," and in smaller letters below, "All are welcome here." There was more. Margaret Kovach had emigrated from Hungary with her family in 1922, when she was 11 years old. Her father worked in the steel mills. She had grown up in the North Side and worked from the age of 14 in various jobs in the neighborhood, saving money with a focus and consistency that several articles mentioned with admiring disbelief. In 1928, at 17 years old, she had applied for a small business loan at a Pittsburgh bank and been refused because she was a woman. She applied at 3 other banks and was refused 3 more times. She then borrowed money from 12 different families in her community, people who believed in her when the banks did not, and used that money to purchase the vacant lot on Allegheny Avenue and hire a contractor to build the cinema she had been planning since she was 15. I read that part twice. She had run the cinema from 1931 until her death in 1978, 47 years. One article from 1964, written on the occasion of the cinema's 33rd anniversary, quoted her as saying that a cinema is not a building. A cinema is a promise you make to your neighbors that their stories matter as much as anyone else's. After her death, the cinema had passed briefly to a nephew who kept it running for a few years before closing it in 1981. No subsequent owners were recorded. The property had simply sat, accumulating tax debt and neglect, and the particular silence of a place that has been loved. and then abandoned. Now, sitting on the floor of the projection booth, I read Margaret's notebook and found something far more than a community archive. She had started filming the families of her neighborhood in 1935. She had bought a second-hand 16mm camera from a photographer closing his studio, spent 2 months learning to use it, and then simply started showing up. At family gatherings, at block parties, at weddings and baptisms and birthday parties and union meetings. She filmed because she understood something that history books and newspapers did not seem to understand, which was that the real history of a place is not the history of its important people, it is the history of its ordinary ones. The steelworker who sang opera in his kitchen on Sunday mornings, the woman who grew tomatoes on her fire escape and distributed them to neighbors every August, the children who played in the hydrant spray in summer. She wrote about them all, by name, with the particularity of someone who paid attention to people as a practice, as a discipline, as a form of devotion. I read the notebook, and I understood finally what she had meant by the words carved into the lintel above the entrance, where ordinary people become part of the story. She had not been talking about the Hollywood films she showed on her screen. She had been talking about this, about making sure the people of her neighborhood were not just audience, that their own lives, their own faces, their own moments of joy and grief and ordinary dailiness were part of the story too. I closed the notebook and sat in the silence of the projection booth, and outside I could hear the distant sounds of Pittsburgh, the traffic on the avenue, and the far-off sound of a train. And I thought about a girl who had been told no 4 times and had found 12 other ways. And I thought about myself, 19 years old, on the floor of an abandoned cinema, with a notebook in my lap, and a camping lantern, and a cracked phone. And I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. I felt like I was in the right place. But then I turned to the final pages of the notebook, near the last entries, looking for the date of the last filming she had done, and I saw something that stopped my breath entirely. A name, written in that same precise, slanting handwriting. A name I recognized, a name I had known my entire life, attached to a person I had been told, my entire life, did not exist. I closed the notebook. I set it down on the wooden table beside the projector. I stood up and pressed my back against the cold metal shelving and tried to steady my breathing in a room that suddenly felt much smaller than it had a moment before. I needed to read it again. I needed to understand what it meant before I could say it out loud or let myself believe it. What I can tell you is that from that moment forward, nothing about my life in the Kovacs cinema was the same. The cold was the same. The sleeping bag on the terrazzo floor was the same. The shifts at Hartley's were the same. But I was not the same. Something had opened in me that could not be closed, and the opening felt not like a wound, but like a window. Like the first real light I had seen in a long time, coming from a projector that had been waiting in the dark for 40 years, pointed at a screen that had not forgotten how to receive it. What I did not know yet, sitting in that cold booth with my hands shaking and that name still burning in my mind, was that someone else already knew those canisters were there, someone who had been waiting much less patiently than Margaret Kovacs's projector, someone with lawyers and blueprints and a very different idea about what should be done with the building at 914 Allegheny Avenue. That part of the story was about to find me whether I was ready for it or not. The name in the notebook was my grandmother's. I want to say that again because the first time I say it, it does not quite feel real even to me, even now, even after everything that came after. The name in Margaret Kovacs's handwriting, in the final pages of that cloth-bound green notebook, in a sealed projection booth in an abandoned cinema that I had bought for $200 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, was the name of a woman I had been told my entire life did not exist. My mother never spoke about her own mother, not once, not in a way that gave me anything real. When I was small and asked the questions that children ask, where is Grandma, why don't we see her, what was she like, my mother would go very still in a particular way and then redirect the conversation with such practiced efficiency that I eventually stopped asking. By the time I was 12, I had concluded that whatever had happened there was something my mother had decided to seal away, and I had learned, as I had learned everything about living with my mother, to respect the sealed places and not press on them. What I knew about my maternal grandmother fit into a single sentence. Her name was Anna. She had died before I was born. That was it. No last name offered. No photograph ever shown to me. No stories. No grave I had ever been taken to visit. Just a name and a fact, and the clear understanding that the subject was closed. Anna. The entry in Margaret's notebook was dated June of 1967. It was longer than most of the other entries, which tended to be brief notations about filming dates and family names and small observations about the people she had photographed. This one was different. This one read like something she had needed to write rather than something she had simply recorded. I'm going to try to reproduce what it said as faithfully as I can, because I have read those words so many times since that first night that I believe I know them the way you know a song you have heard since childhood. She wrote, "I filmed the Howarth family today on Perrysville Avenue. Anna was there with her daughter, who must be about 4 years old now, a serious little girl with her mother's eyes who watched the camera the entire time without blinking, which made the other children laugh. Anna asked me afterward if she could see the film when it was developed. I told her, of course, I always show the families their films, that is the whole point. She said, I want her to be able to see this someday, even if I am not here to tell her about it myself. I asked her what she meant, and she looked at me with those eyes that I have never quite been able to photograph correctly because they hold too many things at once, and she said, you know how it is, Margaret. Some things you know before they happen. I did not ask her anything more. I loaded a new reel and we talked about something else. But I keep thinking about what she said. Some things you know before they happen. I hope she is wrong. I do not think she is wrong. The daughter with her mother's eyes. I sat in the projection booth for a very long time after I read that passage. The camping lantern made a small circle of yellow light around me, and beyond it, the shelves of canisters disappeared into the dark. 348 families, and somewhere on one of those shelves was a canister with my mother's name on it. My mother, 4 years old, a serious little girl who watched the camera without blinking. And my grandmother, Anna, asking Margaret Kovach to make sure that someday, even if she was not there to explain it, her daughter would be able to see proof that she had existed. She had died that same year, 1967. I would find that out later, from the records at the Allegheny County Courthouse, where a death certificate listed Anna Howarth, age 29, survived by one daughter. My mother would have been 4 years old when she lost her. 4 years old, and the woman who had raised her afterward, whoever that woman was, had apparently decided that the most efficient way to handle the grief and the complicated history was to simply erase Anna from the family story, to say she did not exist, to say there were no photographs, no records, no evidence, nothing to show a child who was asking questions, except that there was evidence. There had always been evidence, stored in a metal canister on a shelf in a projection booth on Allegheny Avenue, maintained by a woman who had understood in the summer of 1967 that some things needed to be kept, even when the people who made them were gone. I found the canister 2 days later. It was labeled with the Howarth name and the date, June 1967. I held it in my hands for a long time before I did anything else. It was lighter than I expected. It was warm from the room, not cold, and I remember noticing that and thinking that it was strange to think about warmth and film and the preservation of light. I could not watch it yet. I did not have the means to project a 16mm reel, and even if I had, I am not sure I was ready. There are things you need to approach slowly. There are doors you need to stand in front of for a while before you go through them. So I put the canister back on the shelf exactly where I had found it, and I went back downstairs, and I lay in my sleeping bag on the terrazzo floor, and I thought about Margaret Kovach. I thought about a woman who had been 17 years old and been told no by 4 banks and had found 12 other ways. I thought about 47 years of keeping a promise to a neighborhood. I thought about a woman who had looked at an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in the life of an ordinary family and had understood that it was worth preserving, that it was worth all the trouble of a camera and film and a projector and decades of careful storage in a sealed room. I thought about her writing that entry about my grandmother and the daughter with her mother's eyes, and knowing in some way that something was coming, and deciding that the record needed to exist. The problem arrived on a Wednesday morning in February, about 6 weeks after I moved in. I was at the Hartley's market when Mr. G called me over to the counter and told me there had been a man asking for me the day before, when I was off shift. He said the man had left a card. The card was white with blue lettering, and it said Meridian Development Group. And below that it said a name I will not use here. And below that it said Director of Acquisitions. I put the card in my pocket and finished my shift and walked back to the cinema. There was a notice taped to the front door. I read it standing on the sidewalk in the February cold. It was a letter on legal letterhead, addressed to the owner of the property at 914 Allegheny Avenue, notifying me that Meridian Development Group had filed a legal challenge to the city auction through which I had purchased the property, alleging procedural irregularities in the notification process for the original tax lien sale. The letter stated that Meridian had a pending application with the City of Pittsburgh Planning Commission for a mixed-use residential and commercial development on the site, which had been in process for approximately 14 months prior to the auction, and that their attorneys were of the opinion that this application created a prior claim that superseded my purchase. It requested that I contact their legal department at my earliest convenience to discuss the terms of a potential property transfer. A potential property transfer. I read the letter twice. I put it in my pocket with the business card. I went inside and sat on the floor of the auditorium in one of the dusty seats in the front row and looked at the yellowed screen and thought. I had understood at some level that a building in a city redevelopment zone would not stay invisible forever. What I had not understood was how fast the trouble would come or how well organized it would be when it arrived. Meridian Development Group, I discovered that evening, was a real estate company headquartered in Philadelphia with projects across Pennsylvania and Ohio. They specialized in what their website called adaptive reuse of historic urban properties, which in practice meant buying buildings in gentrifying neighborhoods and converting them into expensive condominiums. I called the library the next morning, the same reference librarian who had helped me find the newspaper clippings. I asked her if she knew anything about the rules around historic landmark designation in Pittsburgh and whether a building could be protected from demolition under such a designation, and if so, how you would go about applying for one. She said she did not know the details, but she knew someone who would, and she gave me the name and phone number of a professor in the Historic Preservation Program at the University of Pittsburgh. His name was Professor Daniel Reese, and he called me back within 4 hours of my leaving a message, which I had not expected, and when I explained what I had found in the projection booth he was quiet for a moment, and then said, "I am sorry, can you repeat that?" I repeated it. He was quiet again. Then he said, "How soon can I come see it?" He came the following Saturday with 2 graduate students and a woman named Dr. Susan Park, who he introduced as his colleague from the Film Studies department. I let them into the cinema and took them upstairs to the projection booth and stood back and watched their faces. Dr. Park picked up the first canister she touched, the way you pick up something you are afraid might not be real. She read the label. She set it down carefully. She picked up another. She turned to me with an expression that I did not know how to read at the time, and have since come to understand as the expression of someone who has just encountered something they had stopped believing they would ever encounter. She said, "Do you understand what this is?" I said, "I thought so." She said, "This is one of the most significant collections of working-class documentary film from the mid-20th century that I have ever seen in a non-institutional setting." She said, "This is the kind of archive that film historians spend careers hoping to find." She said, "Margaret Kovach is not an unknown figure in Pittsburgh film history, but this collection is far beyond anything that has been previously documented." She said all of this in a very calm voice while holding a film canister labeled Nguyen Family Reunion, August 1962. Professor Reese had been examining the building itself and came to stand in the doorway of the projection booth. He said the building qualified on multiple criteria for historic landmark designation under both city and Pennsylvania state historic preservation guidelines. He said the architectural significance of the Art Deco facade alone would support a nomination, and the documentary significance of the film archive would substantially strengthen any application. He said the application process took time, several months at minimum, but that there were emergency protection measures that could be pursued while the formal designation was pending. He also said, and I want you to understand, that this is important. Whoever is trying to acquire this property knew it was here, or suspected it was here. And they moved fast, because once this archive is documented and the building is nominated, their legal challenge becomes very difficult to sustain. I told him about the Meridian Development Group letter. He said, I know Meridian. He said it in a tone that told me everything I needed to know about what he thought of Meridian. Then he said, I'm going to make some calls this week, and I suggest you do not contact their legal department until you have spoken to someone who specializes in historic property law. He gave me the name of a lawyer who worked with the Pittsburgh Preservation Alliance on a pro bono basis. I called her the next morning. Her name was Caroline Marsh, and she was direct and efficient in a way that made me feel, for the first time since the letter had appeared on my door, that I was not entirely alone in this. She said the procedural challenge they have filed is thin. She said the auction was conducted in full compliance with city regulations and the notification requirements were met. She said their prior claim argument is not well supported in Pennsylvania property law. She said the real question is whether we can get the landmark nomination filed and accepted before they find another angle. She said the archive Dr. Park described is exactly the kind of documentation that landmark applications are built on. She said, we are going to fight this, and I think we are going to win. The months that followed were the hardest and the best of my life, sometimes simultaneously. The hard part was the uncertainty. There were filings and counter-filings, and a hearing before the Planning Commission where I sat in a room with Meridian's lawyers and their projected revenue figures and their language about urban revitalization that meant the opposite of what it sounded like. Caroline Marsh sat next to me and was calm and precise and occasionally said things that made the Meridian lawyers visibly uncomfortable. Professor Reese and Dr. Park each submitted written statements documenting the architectural and cultural significance of the property. The best part was what was happening in the projection booth while all of that was unfolding. Dr. Park and her graduate students had begun the process of cataloging and assessing the archive. They came twice a week, setting up equipment in the booth and working through the canisters systematically, documenting the condition of each reel, noting the subjects and dates, running test projections on a small screen they had brought from the university. I was there for as many of these sessions as my shifts at Hartley's allowed, and on the evenings when they were working, I would sit in the booth and watch and listen and hold the notebook and think about Margaret. One evening in March, Dr. Park called me over to the small projection screen. She said, I want to show you something. She had threaded a reel onto the portable projector they had brought. The image that appeared on the screen was of a backyard somewhere in Pittsburgh, a summer day in the 1960s, with the kind of oversaturated color that 16mm film from that era has, all greens slightly too green and skies slightly too blue. There were children running through a sprinkler, a man in a short-sleeved shirt laughing at something off camera, and at the edge of the frame, partially turned away, a young woman who stopped and looked directly at the lens for just a moment before turning back to the children. Dr. Park said, "This is from the Howarth reel, June 1967. I think you should see it." I looked at the young woman at the edge of the frame. She was perhaps 28 or 29 years old. She had dark hair, and she was wearing a yellow dress, and she was looking at the camera with an expression that I recognized immediately because I had seen it in mirrors my entire life. It was the expression of someone who is paying more attention than they are letting on, someone who holds more things than they show. She had my eyes, or I had hers. I understand now that those two statements mean the same thing. I did not cry in the projection booth. I waited until I was downstairs in the lobby, sitting on the terrazzo floor in the dark after everyone had gone, and then I cried for a long time. Not sad crying, or not entirely. The kind of crying that happens when something that has been held very tightly for a very long time is finally allowed to release. My mother had never seen her mother's face. My mother had grown up without a single image of the woman who had given her those eyes, and the image had been here all along, on a shelf in the dark in a building that the city had been trying to sell for $200 for years. The Planning Commission ruled in my favor in April. The procedural challenge was dismissed. The landmark nomination, expedited due to the significance of the film archive, was accepted by the City Historic Preservation Office in May. The Kovach Cinema at 914 Allegheny Avenue was designated a historic landmark of the city of Pittsburgh, with full protection from demolition or exterior alteration. Caroline Marsh called me with the news at 7 in the morning, and I was already awake because I had barely slept for 3 nights. She said, "It is done." And then she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I want you to know that in 20 years of doing this work, I have not seen an archive like that one. Margaret Kovach built something extraordinary, and you were the one who found it. The money came next, and it came from directions I had not anticipated." Dr. Park submitted the archive documentation to the Library of Congress Moving Image Archive, which expressed immediate interest and sent a team to Pittsburgh to assess the collection in June. Their report described the Kovach Cinema film collection as a unique and irreplaceable record of working-class immigrant life in mid-20th century Pittsburgh and recommended its classification as a National Cultural Heritage Resource. A foundation that funded documentary film preservation in American cities reached out to Professor Rees in July and offered a grant of $300,000 for the physical restoration of the cinema building and the professional preservation of the film archive. A streaming platform that had been building a library of American documentary content contacted Dr. Park in August and proposed a partnership to digitize and distribute the entire Kovach archive, with a licensing arrangement that would provide ongoing revenue to support the cinema's operations. I sat in the front row of the auditorium, the same dusty seat where I had sat reading the Meridian letter in February, and I looked at the numbers in front of me on a spreadsheet that Caroline Marsh had helped me put together, and I tried to understand what was happening. 8 months earlier, I'd been sleeping in a shelter on the North Side with $212 in a bank account. Now I was looking at a restoration budget and a revenue model, and the beginnings of something that was starting to look improbably like an institution. The renovation took 7 months. Professor Rees connected me with a contractor who specialized in historic building restoration and who treated the Art Deco facade with a care that I found genuinely moving. Mr. G at Hartley's Market threw a small celebration when the landmark designation was announced, and inside the card, signed by the whole staff, was a handwritten note from him that said simply, "I knew it when you came in asking for ours." The marquee was restored. New letters in the original font, all of them present and correct this time. The terrazzo floor was cleaned and repaired, and shone the way it must have shone in 1931. The seats were reupholstered. The screen was replaced. The projection booth was preserved exactly as it had been, with the original projector maintained in working order, cleaned and polished and ready. We reopened on a Saturday evening in October, a year and 2 weeks after I had first put the key in the lock. I had thought about what the reopening should be for a long time. There were people who suggested a gala, a fundraiser, something with press and speeches, and the kind of visibility that would draw attention to the cinema and to the archive. I understood their reasoning, and I appreciated it, and I said no. I said the first night should be what the Kovach Cinema had always been, a night for the community. Free admission, open doors. I placed notices in the neighborhood. I worked with a local newspaper and a community radio station. I contacted the families of some of the people in the reels, the ones whose descendants still lived in Pittsburgh, and I invited them personally. On the night of the reopening, the line on the sidewalk stretched past the laundromat and around the corner. I stood in the lobby and watched people walk through the doors, and I thought about Margaret Kovach, standing in this same lobby in October of 1932, watching people come in for the first time. I thought about the 12 families who had lent her money when the bank said no. I thought about the steelworker who sang opera in his kitchen. I thought about a young woman in a yellow dress at the edge of a frame, looking directly at the camera, knowing something. We showed 3 reels that night. I had chosen them carefully. One was a street scene from the 1940s, showing the neighborhood in summer, children and adults, and a pushcart and a dog, and an entire ordinary afternoon that had been going on for 70 years in the dark. One was a wedding from 1955, that made people in the audience gasp when they recognized faces. And the third was the Howarth reel from June of 1967. I had not told my mother I was coming. I had not told her anything. I had sent a letter to her address with a ticket for the reopening night, no note, just the ticket, and I had not known if she would come or not. I had decided that whatever she chose was her choice to make, and that my part in it was simply to make sure the evidence existed. That was what Margaret had understood. That was the promise she had made. You do not control what people do with the truth. You only control whether the truth survives to be found. I saw her when the third reel started. She was sitting about halfway back in the center of a row, and she was watching the screen with her hands folded in her lap and an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not the careful blankness I knew, not the efficient redirection, something else, something open and unguarded and a little frightened, the way a person looks when they are standing at the edge of something they have been avoiding for a very long time and have decided, finally, to look over. The young woman in the yellow dress appeared on the screen. She moved through the frame. She turned. She looked at the camera for that moment with those eyes that I had spent my whole life looking back from. My mother made a sound that I had never heard from her before. It was very quiet, and I doubt anyone around her heard it, but I heard it because I was watching her and not the screen. It was the sound of something breaking open, the sound of a sealed place finally admitting air. I did not go to her right away. I gave her time. I stayed in the back of the auditorium and let the reel finish, and let the lights come up slowly the way they do at the end of a film, gradually, the way you ease back into the world after having been somewhere else. When I did walk down the aisle toward where she was sitting, she was still in her seat. Everyone else was standing and talking, and the room was full of the particular noise of people who have been moved by something and are trying to explain to each other what they felt. She looked up at me. I sat down in the empty seat next to her. We did not talk for a while. We sat in the restored seats of the Kovac Cinema on Allegheny Avenue and looked at the clean new screen and did not say anything, and the noise of the room went on around us, and outside through the walls I could hear Pittsburgh going about its Saturday night, and inside this building that someone had built with borrowed money and kept for 47 years and named with her own name, 2 women were sitting in the quiet at the center of everything. My mother finally said, "How long have you had this?" I said, "About a year." She said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I thought about that for a moment. Then I said, "Because I needed to understand it first, and because I thought you needed to be ready to see it." She looked at me. She looked at me the way she had not looked at me in a long time, maybe ever, without the management and the maintenance and the careful distance. She looked at me, and I looked back at her, and I thought about a serious little girl with her mother's eyes who had watched the camera without blinking, and I thought about what it costs a person to grow up without knowing where their eyes came from. She said, "Your grandmother used to say that some things you know before they happen." I said, "I know, I read that. I know." I read. We stayed in the cinema until most of the other guests had gone. We sat in the front row, which is not the best row for watching a film, but is the right row for certain conversations, and we talked for the first time about the things that had always been sealed. It was not easy, and it was not simple, and it did not resolve everything in a night, because nothing real resolves in a night, but it was a beginning. The kind of beginning that is made possible when someone somewhere, a long time ago, decided that the evidence needed to exist. That was 2 years ago. The Kovac Cinema is open every weekend now, and on Tuesday evenings we host Reel Nights, where community members come in to watch reels from the archive and help identify the families and faces they contain. The Library of Congress has completed the digitization of the entire collection. The streaming platform launched the Kovac archive as a dedicated channel, and the response has been larger than any of us anticipated. People from all over the country have written to say they recognized a face, a name, a neighborhood corner. One woman in California found footage of her grandparents' first apartment in Pittsburgh, a place she had heard about her whole life and never seen. A man in Florida wrote to say that a reel from his father's union meeting in 1948 was the first time he had ever seen his father young and hopeful. Margaret Kovac wrote in her notebook that these people deserve to be remembered, that 50 years from now someone is going to want to know who they were. She was right. She has always been right. She was just off by a few years on the timeline. I think about her every time I unlock the front door. I think about the 12 families who lent her money when the bank said no. I think about the timer she set on that projector before she died, that mechanical heartbeat going at 8 o'clock every night for 40 years, calling out to anyone who might be listening. I think about what it means to build something not for yourself, but for the person who has not arrived yet. To leave a light on for someone you have never met, because you understand that they are coming, and that when they get there, they are going to need exactly what you left behind. I was kicked out at 19 with a garbage bag and $212. I took a loan and bought an abandoned cinema for $200 that the whole neighborhood called haunted, moved in with a sleeping bag and a camping lantern and no plan. Nothing but the stubbornness of someone who has spent her whole life being told she does not fit and has finally decided that the fitting was never the point. And in the dark of that building, in a sealed room that had been waiting for 40 years, I found 348 families. I found a woman who had done something extraordinary because she believed that ordinary people deserved to have their stories kept. And I found my grandmother, in a yellow dress in a Pittsburgh backyard in the summer of 1967, looking directly at the camera with my eyes, knowing something, leaving a record, trusting that someone would find it. She was not wrong to trust. Margaret's story teaches us that the most abandoned places sometimes hold the most irreplaceable things, that the work of keeping a promise does not end when the person who made it is gone, that somewhere in a building the world has written off, someone is going to walk through a door with a key in their hand and find exactly what they were looking for, even when they had no idea they were looking. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to believe that starting over is possible. Share it with someone who has been told they do not belong anywhere. Share it with someone who has a sealed place inside them and is wondering if they will ever be ready to look over the edge. And tell me in the comments, would you have taken out a loan to buy a haunted cinema that the whole neighborhood was afraid to enter for just $200? I want to know, because I think more people than you might expect would say yes. And to those people I want to say, the door is worth opening. Whatever is on the other side has been waiting a long time.